ayahuasca or DMT, if one has DMT. Before I had ever had DMT, I knew a number of people who had taken it, and a friend of mine who became quite enthusiastic about it one summer was very enthusiastic in this kind of like, you don't understand, like it reveals things. It's the really real world, right? And, I'm no longer afraid of death and so on and so forth. And I kept saying, okay, like maybe that counts. What are you bringing back, basically? Like telling me that it's the really real world doesn't do a lot because this is where I live for now. So what are you bringing back? Granted, removing a fear of death does seem like a pretty good thing, but can you translate that to other people? When I finally had DMT, I was struck both because the experience that I had, and granted, it might have been influenced by this reading, but the experience that I had was very, very much what had been reported to me. Like it was strikingly, what it said on the tin. It was like, oh, wow, this is really exactly what it's like. People are not talking shit. This is exactly what it's like. So, after about an hour, when I was ready to talk to my sitter, who was also interviewing me because we wanted to assess whether or not it represented sort of an authentic mystical experience or whether it met the conditions of the Hood mystical scale. And one of the things that I said at the time was, if I didn't have my particular set of, I hesitate to say skepticism, but if I didn't have the particular kind of agnostic holding things lightly that I do, I suspect the experience would have convinced me of the reality of my immortal soul, right? Like it really presents with a kind of certainty and familiarity, right? And it happens to be the case that because, I have done a fair bit of exploration in this way, I have created a system where I'm like, just because you're experiencing certainty doesn't mean something is the case. Just because something seems familiar doesn't mean that it is familiar. It just means that you're having that experience. So it could provoke that experience and not literally be the case. But if you're not used to thinking in those terms, and I think most people aren't, most people, if they experience a sense of certainty, are just like, well, yeah, I'm certain, right? Whereas for me, it's like, certainty is highly unreliable. It's not there when you want. It's often there when you don't. You can think of plenty of people who are certain about things and you're quite certain they're wrong. Like certainty is not a very good guide for things. But having a flood awareness of a kind of certainty is likely to be the kind of thing that people on board. So, I think about it a bit like that. There are definitely experiences that you have in magical practice which, seem to underline religious premises, religious broadly construed premises in various ways, right? In some cases, you make contact with something and it really like blasts its way in. But the question I'm always asking is like, okay, well, that's the experience I'm having. But what does that actually mean? Like what's actually happening here, right? And I try to hold that, as very, very provisionally. I try not to, in fact, I deliberately avoid hitting fixed conclusions. But nevertheless, yeah, I would say that like something like psilocybin, for instance, which tends to produce sort of lasting mystical intuitions and a sense of connectedness, it's like the fact that you've had that experience is not indicative that that is the case. But that doesn't mean that having the experience is not going to leave you with a certain feeling around that. And I suspect that magic is very similar. In the modern magical tradition, starting with the deeply problematic but nevertheless influential figure Aleister Crowley, Crowley was very, very insistent on a deep kind of skepticism. He was like, you don't have to believe in any of this. You just have to do the things and see what happens. It's really experimentalist kind of approach. And his failings as a human being notwithstanding, that's an approach that I consider to be extremely rational. It's like, we're dealing with things that we do not have full explanations of. So let's attempt the procedures and see what happens. And interestingly enough, I would say it's widely reported, and certainly within my experience, that when you undertake these procedures, certain kinds of things happen. That seems pretty straightforward to me.
When you say that something like DMT creates experiences of certainty, I wonder if there are drugs that create experiences of extreme uncertainty. Maybe you could have the opposite experience.
Oh,
Like,
sure.
I was talking to a
Absolutely.
friend about datura, very toxic hallucinogen, recently, and
Mhm.
the
Yeah,
bizarre
doesn't seem fun
experiences.
to me.
Doesn't seem fun. It seems awful, and you think something's happening, and then it really isn't, and you just hurt yourself or
Yeah,
end up in a ditch.
sure. I mean, when I had my first really powerful breakthrough experience with Salvia, which now is 20 years ago, um, Salvia blew me out of my boots. I did not expect, and it was, I've given a talk on this online, so it's easy enough for people to sort of hear the account of this. But I, I was a bit cavalier with it, and I probably had slightly more than I should have. It's not that it was sort of toxically unsafe or anything, but I wasn't operating what you would call scientific best standards. The experience that I had was, in some ways, the most terrifying 5 minutes of my life, and deeply, deeply attacked a set of assumptions that I had about the world and myself and time and space and death and whatever. For quite some time immediately afterwards, I was very much like in a walking on eggshells, like I'm expecting things to destabilize at any moment, right? Once that started to settle down, I think the construal effects that were introduced by Salvia, that there really, it's a direct experience, that there really are countless ways to frame your experience that are potentially coherent but not what you normally do, right? It's hard not to onboard a certain amount of, I don't want to call belief, but like entertaining the idea that perhaps it's not all as simple as it seems, perhaps there are alternate layers. That's been a fairly consistent feature of my experience, is that by showing you certain things, ayahuasca was very similar. Ayahuasca was not a dramatic experience, in say in the way that some of my other experiences have been, but the experience that it gave me is like, there is this mythically infused form of consciousness that is one step sideways from here. And to the extent that you're not paying attention to it, you're missing half the game. It was this kind of experience of like, duh, there's an obviousness to this. Um, that's not something that is necessarily guiding my everyday action, but definitely present. The idea that there are different ways to see. And so, yeah, sure. I think that there are lots of things that can challenge your normal framing and thus increase your cognitive flexibility, right?
Mm.
Because once you've touched on those states in some way, shape, or form, you're never quite the same. Everybody who's ever taken psychedelics the first time, they have two chief concerns, it seems to me. One is, oh God, now I'm crazy, and this is never going to end, right? And what you don't tell people in advance is, yeah, this does change you. It changes you forever, right? Like you do, obviously, you're not going to be in this sort of peak experience, whatever that you're in now, but this does, in fact, change the way that you see at some level forever. And that seems to be, fairly well reflected in some of the more recent psychedelic studies. And, for instance, single dose psilocybin mystical experience can seemingly long-term increase openness, for instance. I suspect that there are other comparable personality factors that can be tweaked. Like I have a theory that uh, Iboga tabernanthe, so ibogaine, but really I'm talking about the full alkaloid complex. But yeah, that Iboga tabernanthe probably increases conscientiousness. This is my theory based on observations, right? So I suspect that yes, they can alter your perspective in various ways, but that, there's benefit to doing so, provided that you can still have the self-forming center, that you can take the precautions necessary to keep yourself integrated at some level. What you're in fact doing is increasing range, cognitive flexibility, and that is generally speaking beneficial.